Okay, welcome everyone to today's Arthur J.E. Child policy pop-up. Today we're going to be discussing the global energy crises, what is going on, and what exactly does that mean for Canada. My name is Brendan Cook. I'll be the moderator and host for today's webinar. I'm a policy analyst here at the Canada West Foundation with our Natural Resource Centre. For anyone who is a newcomer to Canada West's events, the Canada West Foundation is a nonpartisan, independent public policy think tank. And we're really focused on advocating for good policy for Western Canada, and in doing so, advocating for good policy for Canada as a whole. So these pop-up events really give us a chance to highlight important and timely events that are going on around the world, and trying to get into them as they happen. So, and today is really no different than that. I can't really think of anything right now that's more timely and more important with regard to energy news than these crises that are unfolding around the world. Over the last month, couple months, we've seen rising energy prices, rising electricity prices. We've seen the natural gas prices going through the roof in Europe, gasoline shortages in the UK, and we've seen rolling blackouts throughout Asia, specifically in China. So what we're trying to do today is really get to explain what's going on. This is a true pop-up. We just started planning it last week. And based on the attendance that we see here today, it's clearly an issue that has a lot of importance to a wide range of people. So without further ado, we'll pass it over to our panelists to introduce themselves here today. Tim, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Brendan. I'm Timothy Egan. I'm President and CEO of the Canadian Gas Association, which is the trade association for the delivery side of the natural gas industry in Canada.
Thank you. Bud, we'll go to you next then.
Thank you, Brendan. Hello, everybody. Bud Block here. I'm a principal of the Principal Strategy Group. We're in Ottawa, formerly I was a special advisor for the environment.
Oh, you're cutting out there a little bit, Bud. You're really quiet.
Sorry about that. Bud Block here, principal with the Principal Strategy Group. Formerly was a special advisor for energy and environment for the United States Embassy in Canada.
Awesome, thank you. And not last but not least, Sharon.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon Sun. I am the trade policy economist at Canada West Foundation, and I'm also the Distinguished Fellow for Asia Pacific Foundation.
Awesome, thank you. Well, yeah, I know I've been, I'd say I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, but as I said, we just started looking at it last week, so been looking forward to it all week at the very least. But yeah, let's just dive right in. So when we're looking at what's going on right now, a lot of the focus has been put on the natural gas prices that we're seeing in Europe. They're hitting all-time highs right now. There's a lot of talk about shortages. So I'd like to just start off with really discussing what exactly is going on in Europe right now.
Well, I'll jump in, Brendan. I think as I was joking with Brendan before, that the answer to every question on what's going on is it's a market, and I think that's kind of the answer to what's happening in Europe. There are supply constraints around the world, and there is significant demand growth around the world, and you combine those two and prices go up. Now, there's specific things happening in specific markets that are exacerbating both of those. On the supply side, a lot of supply that had been going into Europe was off because of maintenance requirements on supply facilities. Other European supply sources are directing that supply to other markets, which drives prices up. They've had some rough weather. September is a very cold month, so that exacerbates demand and creates additional problems. And then, of course, you can look at other contributing factors that are sort of longer term, but I think significant contributing factors, like the fact that some European markets like the UK have very little in the way of gas storage. There are a variety of reasons for that, but if you don't have gas storage, then in a moment of of a supply crunch, you can't rely on your own reserves, your own storage supply in order to meet demand. In addition, let's face it, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for new supply development in many markets, right? So again, you look at the UK, which sits on significant natural gas supply of its own, but at present has a ban on fracking, so is not developing new resources. So a variety of factors contributing to, I think, kind of a classic market crunch situation, and you're seeing prices rise as a consequence. That's a sort of high-level assessment.
I'll chime in. I've changed my mechanism here. I'm getting some messages that people couldn't hear me. Hopefully folks can hear me now. I'd just like to add a bit to what Tim mentioned. And one of the key issues here is maybe just some further context. So the price of natural gas on spot markets right now in Asia, for example, is 10 times what it was this time last year, $33 US per million BTUs. It's about the same in the Netherlands. It's about 33 in Asia, 32 in the Netherlands, and in the Henry Hub, it's about $6, $5.70 or something today, right? And that's the highest it's been since 2008. The numbers are off the charts, right? And there are a variety of reasons. I mean, some of them are systemic, some of them are just haphazard. I mean, you've seen, for example, a whole bunch of serious issues with outages that weren't planned in places like Qatar, which is the largest supplier. You had fires in Russian plants, two big plants in Russia's Arctic. We had shutdowns in the Gulf Coast complex of Texas because of hurricane, the winter storms and Hurricane Ida. Now, those things by themselves might not necessarily create havoc, but in the past 10 years, what we've seen is that what used to be local and regional disruptions to gas flow are now globalized. I mean, natural gas used to be a very localized commodity, and it's strange. The volumes are gigantic, but the fungible commodification of gas as a tradable thing has really made an impact. So these localized issues become manifest in the markets, around the world. It's what we're talking about here is a systems problem, or a systems challenge.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, thank you both. It does really seem right now like it could be kind of a perfect storm situation. So I know, as you said, Bud, like there's definitely some systemic issues at the heart of this as well. But between seeing, the decrease in coal capacity, decrease in nuclear capacity through a lot of Europe right now, then we've had the issue of just the wind not blowing when we need it to blow. It does really seem like this might be a bit of a perfect storm. Do you guys see this improving quickly, or are these systemic issues really going to outlast the coincidences maybe?
Maybe I'll chime in because I think my audio is still problematic, and I'll get into what I can get in now. Look, the U.S. Energy Information Administration is saying prices are going to remain high in the United States this winter season. Every other analytical group that looks at the issue says the heating season of 2021-22, i.e. winter in the Northern Hemisphere, is going to be hugely problematic because of the challenge to fill, to provide enough resources, whether it's coal or natural gas as a substitute. It's going to persist. And one of the reasons I think too that we need to be concerned is that I mentioned it's a systemic challenge, and we're moving towards a transition period. We're acting like maybe we've already arrived at the transition. We're just in the first 1 million transition in terms of the infrastructure required. The IEA put out a note suggesting one needs $4 trillion a year. $4 trillion with a T, dollars a year of investment in the clean energy space. I'm going to refer to it as non-emitting because it's much more precise. The non-emitting sort of energy sector in order to make a dent and to begin to address, real transition and smooth that transition, speed bumps on the transition. Well, we're not doing that. We're not doing that.
Yeah, and I agree with Bud. I mean, the Russia Energy Week just concluded, and the presidents of 3 of the super majors were making the point that as much as people are talking about transitioning off of fossil fuels, there's a fundamental long-term requirement for more of them in the near and medium term. And so if governments are putting in place policy frameworks that are suggesting that you can ease off of these things quickly, they're actually exacerbating problems that markets in their regular cycles create. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that now. Bud noted that, historically gas markets were much more localized. You talked about independent Asian, American, and European markets. They're increasingly integrated, but I think the price differentials show that they are still relatively distinct. But the policy framework that's affecting price in each of them is kind of the same, in that there are statements being made about a future where fuels like natural gas are not part of the equation. And I think reality is going to hit those statements smack in the face. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that in certain markets right now. The other point Bud made about winter is a big one. I mean, we're coming into the big heating season in the northern half of the planet, and depending on how severe it is, we will require more or less natural gas for heating, because it's the principal heating fuel in the northern hemisphere. And if you don't have it, you're going to scramble to find other things to meet that demand, right? And you will find whatever you can. The reality is we need more of all kinds of energy in the world. And we're seeing all of these stories coming out of a variety of European markets, and then China. I know Sharon's going to talk about the Chinese situation, where suddenly people are scrambling for coal, right? Because if they can't find the gas in the market to meet the demand, they'll use coal, because you can't leave people without heat. The reality is that there are profound, serious consequences when you do so. We'll wait and see how the winter unfolds. The North American situation is a little unique because we do have so much storage, and we do have a remarkably robust transmission and distribution system. And we have enormous supply, right? So we're seeing price increases, but we're not seeing the kind of volatility that you're seeing in the European market, because we have a much stabler a gas infrastructure and gas supply system in North America. But you're still seeing what are, on a percentage basis, significant changes in price.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I think you've probably kind of answered part of where this question was going, but we mentioned the difference right now too between the European markets and the Asian markets in terms of gas pricing. So to different degrees, they're going in the same direction. They're both hitting all-time highs. And so is that really the same situation driving that? Is that a cause of exports being the same exports being used for both European and Asian markets that's driving the prices to go in the same direction, or is there something different at play in Asia right now than what's going on in Europe? I guess for gas specifically, and then we'll quickly flip over because I know I've got tons of questions for Sharon on coal.
Well, let me chime in for what it's worth, as people can hear me. Look, Asia is the market of choice for natural gas, liquid natural gas. If you want to sell LNG, the place you want to sell it is in Asia. Higher prices typically, not just spot price, but the contract price is better. And Europe is the buyer of last resort. That's sort of the way it's worked out. The demand is so colossal in China, for example, that's where people want to go, and you keep getting premium prices for it. The demand and also China has been moving off of coal, trying to bring up its natural gas use. So the market was only going to grow. Whereas in Europe, there were some domestic sources, North Sea, et cetera, closer to gutter, these sorts of things, that meant that maybe you weren't getting premium prices, but that's all changed in the last short while.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add about that is that from a North American perspective, what's happening in the European and the Asian markets should represent significant opportunity, right? Because of the supply picture we have, because of the infrastructure we have, because of the growing LNG export capacity. And the question is, are we putting in place the conditions to seize that opportunity to the extent that we could be? And frankly, I don't think we are yet. I think there's a lot of talk about it, but I don't see, to Bud's point, I don't see demand declining in Asian markets. I see it only growing and growing at significant rates. And the European market is a little different. As Bud noted, there are domestic supply options or regional supply options that make it different. But from a North American perspective, we should be seeing the world as our oyster, if you will, for natural gas exports.
Yeah.
If I could just add, it's as the two speakers said, the demand is there, but from a Canadian and Western Canadian perspective, if we were to just look at the numbers, Canada, in terms of energy export to China, our main export is coal, which is mainly metallurgical coal, and crude oil as the second largest, and then to a much smaller extent LNG. And even these three items that I've just indicated, it's combined is less than 1.3% of Canada's total energy export to the world. Our main export destination is still US. 91% of our energy export goes there. So I think the interesting question is, yes, the demand is there, but the question is, are we able to actually increase the export given the current climate, given the trade infrastructure that we have in place, and also how do we transport these energy sources to countries like China? We export so much to US because we have the infrastructures in place to do so, and we are landlocked. US is just beside us, right? So these are some of the kind of challenges and questions that we really have to think about in terms of in terms of obtaining these opportunities.
So I think maybe that's the perfect foray here then, Sharon, into really what's happening in China right now. So news has been coming out on a daily basis really regarding the rolling blackouts that we're seeing through many of the Chinese provinces right now. Can you give us a little info on what exactly is going on in China right now?
Yeah, sure. So the China power outage phenomenon is very interesting, and the problem for the electricity shortage comes from a combination of various factors. One of them is, as the world is opening up after the COVID lockdown, there's demand for Chinese exports has substantially increased, including aluminum and steel, which is some of China's main exports, and also very electricity heavy intensive exports. So the demand for electricity in China grew at twice the normal pace this year. And since almost 60% of China's economy is powered by coal prices skyrocketed. And then on the other hand, China's electricity prices are set prices by the government, so it's relatively constant. So some of the producers are choosing to shut down their boilers to avoid losses from the tremendous increase in the unaffordable input costs of coal. So that's one aspect. And then you have this other aspect, which is the continuous flooding that northern China have been experiencing from heavy rain, particularly in Shanxi province. So that's a province in northern China, and it's a major coal producing province. So that further affected the coal supply, driving up price. So it definitely made the situation worse. And then there's a third factor, which is China's emission standards and decarbonization priorities. So the country pledged to cut its emission by 3% in 2021, and at least 10 provinces have been struggling to meet Beijing's energy intensity target. And so they've begun to cut electricity consumption to make up for lost time. And so that's extremely inefficient, which the central government has already since addressed. But all of these factors combined, it really increased the coal price, which affected the electricity power shortage right now.
Yeah, and so with China coming out with their 5-year plan this year, and I know they've made a number of statements with regard to, sorry, there we go, a number of statements with regard to with climate objectives. How do you see the government there really responding to this, and how are there any plans in place to account for these shortages that they're seeing right now? Oh, you're still on mute there, Sharon. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, it's a really difficult question, actually. So in the short term, in terms of immediately responding to these shortages, the government has, for example, specifically allocated 10 million tons of coal, putting aside just for electricity generation. The National Development and Reform Commission is actively working with power companies and relevant departments to try to increase the efficiency in production, improve power generation capacity, and trying to increase supply access of coal. So we've seen internationally, we've seen China increasing coal imports from Russia. It's increased by 70% just in the month of September. It's increased import of coal from Kazakhstan, South Africa, Mozambique. Domestically, the government has been pressing mines to boost output even after they've reached annual quotas, I think as of last week. The coal mines that were closed, because they were losing money, they've now been reopened with government subsidies, and regulators have ordered Chinese banks to provide plenty of loans to the coal sector. And then at the regional level, there's emergency plans put in place to prepare for any response to cold, rain, snow, and freezing disasters in preparation for the upcoming winter. So at all levels, in terms of immediate plans, it's being enforced. There's also talks about liberalizing some levels of liberalization in the control of electricity prices. So raising electricity prices for industrial and commercial users to fight this shortfall. But the bigger implication here is that the electricity crunch really shows this bigger problem of China as an increasingly hungry energy hog. And this is going to be a long-term problem and a tough problem that China will be facing. Just going back to Tim's speech about the demand for all kinds of energy. And given that, China has recently at the UN summit on climate change last year, they've pledged to cut carbon dioxide emission. They plan to reach the peak carbon emission before 2030, and then try to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. And then in the recent COP15, they've pledged to accelerate solar and wind power development. So all of these targets are very ambitious. And if we were to think about wind and solar and wind power, China's manufacturing processes for solar panels require enormous amount of electricity, and much of that comes from coal. So it's a really difficult situation in terms of finding substitutes. It's a difficult transitional period, and we should be still seeing continuous high coal prices. That said, it doesn't mean that it's not achievable, but at least in the short to medium term, we see this very painful transitional process of achieving China's goals.
Yeah, and so this might be the hard question to answer here. I mean, you mentioned the peak emissions by 2030, and a few of these other climate promises that they've made, but at the same time, we also know that at this point, over 50% of the power in China is coal-fired. A lot of the solutions that you just mentioned are really around increasing coal imports.
Yeah.
So I mean, in the face of these outages and what frankly could turn into a fair deal of public backlash from Chinese citizens if the shortages remain, do you see the Chinese government really having the ability or the stomach, I guess, to stick it out and achieve those audacious promises that they've made?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what's interesting about the shortage so far is it has not affected residents at all. So the government has mainly limited electricity and scheduled blackouts or temporary scheduled blackouts only at the industrial level. And so from that perspective, I wouldn't think that there would be as much in terms of citizen dissatisfaction, but rather more at the industrial level. There's obviously impact on supply chain, right? Because China manufactures and exports a lot of processed products. So for example, some of the factories that were impacted include battery cell manufacturer, which is supposed to supply to electric vehicles such as Tesla. You have factories that supplies to large international multinational corporations like Apple. And so there is a concern on the reliability now because of this so China's image as a reliable manufacturing base. But I think to address your question in the short run, in order to address the immediate problem, there is need to increase coal just because of how much China is reliant on it. But it doesn't mean that in the longer term, China is not able to achieve these objectives. We've seen quite consistent plans that China has put in place in all levels. For example, its new 5-year plan. So it's China's development plan. So taking into consideration that China has a much longer horizon on implementing and achieving net zero, I think if China says that they're going to shift, it's more likely for them to stick with the plan as they do have a different system.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So I guess we've chatted a bit now about I guess China's take on the net zero promises, but what's kind of come about with a lot of this energy crises discussion is to what extent is the energy transition to blame or involved at all? And so I know there's been a lot of talk about that, perhaps at least in part a transition and a lot of promises, net zero type promises and transitions away from emitting fuels is partially at least to blame for some of the shortages we're seeing and a lack of investment. I'd just like to get your opinions on is that the case? Should we be is it the energy transition to blame, or is this just I guess maybe a coincidence that we're seeing this at the same time as we're seeing an outpouring of action around climate promises?
Is this question for me? Because I think
for everybody.
Tim and Bud would be more
No.
more adequate in answering this.
Anybody jump in? Yeah. Oh, Bud, you are on mute.
There. I think I fixed my volume speaker input. Yeah, somebody give me a thumbs up. Great.
Sounds great.
All right, technical difficulties. And that's what we're experiencing globally with respect to, some of this transition. So are we going to get through this? Is this going to be the only winter we're going to have to deal with this? No. And here's why. One of the challenges is, and this is it's a qualified no, okay? Even when we go to a full transitioned economy, the inputs are still volatile, subject to price volatility, right? If you're talking about lithium, cobalt, whatever for storage batteries, the supply chains are always going to have some risk. And that's just going to be an inherent part of any system, whether it's the one we inhabit now or a future system. There's going to be a risk in terms of supply chain security, price volatility. The real challenge over the next couple of decades, I think, is going to be we're taking a system that produces electricity and energy. Typically, we're talking about coal and gas, and they're dispatchable, they're immediate. It's a fairly common commodity that can be used. And we're going to replace that with non-emitting sources. Most people have in their mind, of course, wind and solar, but of course, conventional hydro and nuclear are just as non-emitting. And so one of the challenges is how do you make that transition so that in a future where there's going to be maybe greater volatility in weather and climate and factors we can control, how do you make sure that the intermittent components of that new energy system are supported by the baseline components? And that's going to be natural gas for a while as a peaking power. Baseline power is going to be important, baseload power, I should say, through typical sources we see in Canada, nuclear and conventional. So yes, it's, whatever you're transitioning, there's going to be difficulty and challenges and adaptation. But a prudent approach would be to look in the forward and say, yeah, we're not going to be there next summer. We're going to be there 10 summers from now. And we need to make the investments, policy investments, infrastructure investments, and I think societal educational investments to understand that this is, a challenge that we have to all rise to meet. I'll turn it to somebody else.
Well, Brendan, maybe I'll weigh in. I don't like the language of transition. I think transition suggests that you've got something bad and you're going to readily change to something good. I think energy systems are in a constant state of gradual evolution. And I think that's for good reason. And I think that has delivered enormous value and continues to deliver enormous value. And I think when you talk about transition, you imply that it's time for a radical change, and that change is being dictated by public authorities who, frankly, aren't very well informed on energy systems, and the consequence of that is bad and I think rash policy decisions that have profoundly negative effects on people. Why did we see the gilets jaunes on the streets of France for so long? Because people were really annoyed about what was happening on energy prices, and at the end of the day, bad policies affect energy markets in a way that raise prices for people. And at a certain point, people get angry. And what happens when they get angry? Well, they're, either throw governments out on their ears or do something else. But the point is it sets off the whole agenda. And the fundamental agenda, I think, is not to get off of natural gas or oil or other fossil fuels from my perspective. The fundamental objective is to reduce emissions. So the discourse, unfortunately, is less about reducing emissions when we talk about net zero or transition. It is about getting off of the fuels. And I think we're seeing the consequences of what happens when you talk about that. So, Sharon's reference to what's happening in China is fascinating. So people have to meet a target. So in order to meet the target, knowing they can't do so with technology or fuels, they actually shut down facilities operating. Now, just try to fathom that happening in North America. Oh, we're not meeting our targets, so we're going to shut work down on Fridays. The implications in an open and democratic society are significantly different than they are in a command and control society. And we should think about that. And we're seeing some of those implications, I think, right now in Europe. And then the other thing I'd say is timelines. We get very excited about setting targets with years, and we've been doing that for several decades. And you are a bit like a skunk at a garden party when you dare to say, we've been doing that for several decades and we haven't achieved any of those. Why are we so convinced that we're going to achieve the next one by this time frame, right? So on the 2030 target that Canada had set, we were roughly 1.5% of the way there in the 16 years from the baseline. So the baseline was 2005. The target is 30% off the 2005 baseline by 2030. We're about 1.5% of the way there. We've got 9 years left to make up the difference. But now we've raised the target. And now we've said, no, not 30%, 40 or 45%. Now, at a certain point, you have to say, not sure this is going to work, folks. Now, so what do? We've set a bigger target for 2050. And you recall the 2050 target is a variation on what the G7 said. At one point, the G7 had said net zero by 2100. I'm not being dismissive of the objective of reducing emissions. I think that's a noble objective. And I think, in my industry, we've done profound things to achieve that objective. One of the single largest contributors to reducing emissions in Canada was the long-term replacement of gas furnaces, right? Which affected a significant reduction because of the higher efficiency of furnaces. A whole series of incremental technology changes like that are usually what helps us achieve the long-term objectives we have. But instead, I think we fixated on a date and a sort of absolute target. And then we started talking about, top-down technology fixes. And the last one I'll mention, and then I'll be quiet, is I think much of the current rhetoric takes us to electrification. Needless to say, I'm not a fan. I'm in the gas industry. But electricity in Canada is roughly 20-25% of energy end use. Gas is in the order of 35-38%, and gas is growing. People don't think about energy delivery as coming in a variety of ways, and as that competition of deliveries being a good thing. We take liquid fuels in the form of gasoline and diesel. We take gaseous fuels through pipes, and currently it's natural gas. It could be hydrogen and renewable gases. And we take electricity over wires. And in a sense, those three systems compete with one another, and that's a really good thing. And so if the objective is reduce emissions and then say, okay, go and make it work, you're going to see those technology systems, you're going to see those delivery systems compete with one another. And that is what will lead to ultimate objectives that everybody's interested in. And I fear that the current policy dynamic is not focused on that sort of sensible approach. Well, obviously, I think it's a sensible approach.
Yeah, no, and it is definitely understandable. I think there's a lot of focus, as you said, right now on these net zero objectives. And I think there's also as you said, it's a lot of this being driven by public discourse, and there's maybe to a degree a lack of appreciation in the complexity that it takes to actually transition a full energy system away from fossil fuels. But also, as you mentioned, so I mean, there are a lot of options for decarbonizing fossil fuels, and one of those big ones is CCUS. And that immediately leads me to kind of what's going on in Canada right now, where in Alberta especially, there's a lot of plans around that. And I'm sure what a lot of people are wondering is really what do these crises mean for Canada, and where are the opportunities and where are the threats? And so I think we touched on it earlier in terms of where some opportunities may lie in Canada and North America's ability to participate in these global markets. But yeah, I'm curious, with the technology that we're pushing out in the form of CCUS or other decarbonization type technologies, and with our access to global markets, where do you guys really think that our opportunities are specifically within Canada?
But here, I'll chime in. First, I just want to say, Tim's points are really, really robust and make a lot of sense. Are people thinking about the best mechanisms to ensure we get to that non-emitting future and not prejudge kind of what the original source might be. There's many technical solutions. And so, when you talk about natural gas as a feedstock for, hydrogen production, and the transmission and distribution system that's available for natural gas maybe being upgraded or refined somehow to carry hydrogen, those are real serious solutions to get us to a low carbon future. When I look at the Canadian program for CCUS, for example, and we've seen that some of the big companies producing oil sands are suggesting $75 billion worth of infrastructure in Alberta alone to help foster that future. And most of that is going to come from, I guess, government and other investors, not necessarily from the companies themselves. But there are other elements, I think, that are somewhat problematic in the North American context. And that has to do with where's the capital going to go to help you build out the CCUS programs and build the infrastructure. And you have two competing systems. In the United States, the 45Q system, which allows for the credits to be obtained when you use the CO2 or the waste gas to be productive in enhanced oil recovery. In Canada, the proposed tax credit does not. And so you have a line at the border where if I'm going to be making investments and I want a return on that investment, the tax climate in the United States is perhaps more attractive than that being proposed in Canada. So I'm very interested in, in a North American economy where we're intertwined. That divergence in tax policy can be pretty significant. We've seen it played out over several decades in the bigger economies in Canada and the United States, with each saying, oh, we have the lowest tax rate, combined tax rate, et cetera. The tax treatment of CCUS and the associated infrastructure is going to be critical to whether Canada is going to be, hitting its mark in that particular field of endeavor.
So I guess in that way, if what you're saying, really the different, our competition in I guess attracting capital for some of these projects with the U.S. And I guess what some of these crises are highlighting, which is a need for decarbonized fuels and still a very large need for fossil fuels in general, is so that is, I guess, a threat to Canadian production in that way, that some investment might be going south of the border due to the ability to raise capital for lower emission fossil fuels?
I think, yes. I mean, it's a competitive environment for capital, and the environment has to be right. There has to be, a market where you can get a return, and if the advantage is elsewhere to make your investment to get that advantage, companies will probably choose to invest there. And here's another thing that layers on top of this that makes it more complicated. As we talk about this period of moving forward over a decade or two to have a low emissions future, one of the challenges here is, there's lots of money being proposed, whether it's from the private sector or whether it's from governments. Billions and billions upon billions of dollars, for example, have been unleashed, $400 billion probably in the last year or so in North America, more than that actually. But one of the challenges is what's the absorptive capacity? So not only is the transition a problem, a challenge in the energy sources we're using, but if we're building new infrastructure on a massive scale, there's only so many companies that can do the planning and the execution of these big projects. There's only so many projects can be done at a time. There's only so many law firms that can do the contract arrangements, in terms of these big mega projects. So the layers. You can dig down, it's like an onion, take the skin off, and there's another challenge. Weighting tax structure, just the absorptive capacity of the industry, construction industry, the service industry to facilitate, the use of capital to bring us this, wonderful new low carbon future.
A couple of points I'd add, Brendan. I mean, I think fundamentally that so if energy prices rise, no matter how much rhetoric one might give forth about where we want to be on a low emission future. If I run a manufacturing facility, my investors are going to want me to be competitive. And a key input is the price of energy. And if I can't compete in a market because the energy prices are high, I'm going to try to find a market where energy prices are lower. And you're seeing that with news stories out of Europe right now, right? Where there's talk of manufacturing facilities looking to leave Europe. And a key reason why China has some of the advantages that Sharon was talking about is because its input costs are so much lower, right? Labor and energy. Energy in the case of China, overwhelmingly coal. So if China is the world's biggest or near largest producer of solar panels or wind turbines, the embedded coal, the embedded carbon in that is something that delivers the advantage to China, right? Because they've been able to do it with cheaper energy. And this goes, I think, to the point I was making earlier, but fundamentally, we have to think about how this affects the consumer, how all of this affects the consumer. And whatever policies you're talking about putting in place, consumers will act on them at some point, if not now, in the near future, in one jurisdiction or another, and say, you know what, I'm not happy with what's happening. You know, the German government has a sort of public safety message that I saw the other day, which they're putting out. And you could say this is just sort of the sort of thing that all governments do, but its timing is pretty interesting. And it shows an elderly woman in her apartment heating herself with candles. And it's showing how to best master the use of candles to heat yourself, right? And a minister of the Crown in the UK said the other day that British citizens should expect blackouts this winter. Now think about that. It's Germany and the United Kingdom are talking about and teaching people how to deal with blackouts. Do you really think that there isn't going to be a significant public uproar about that? I mean, in my view, that's profoundly unacceptable. And as I said earlier, I mean, this frankly will endanger people's well-being. And so, you know, why aren't we stepping back, taking a deep breath and saying, okay, here's where we want to go. What's the best thing to do? And I think the best thing to do is to put in place the basic signals to allow technology to develop as quickly as possible. What are you doing to trigger innovation? Second, and related to that, a country like Canada, because this was your question, right? How is this related to Canada? What can we do for the world, right? What are the low-hanging fruit opportunities around the world that will help us reduce emissions? I'm not convinced that higher targets for Canada and more complicated regulatory and policy regimes for Canada are going to do that. However, exporting a lot more natural gas to China might do a lot in pretty short order in terms of reducing significant emissions, or other Asian markets, or anywhere else in the world, right? Or exporting some of the expertise we already have. You know, we have one of the cleanest energy systems in the world. And I would say in North America has, right? Canada and the United States, their systems are very comparable. We can bring a lot of what we already have to the rest of the world. I think those are the kinds of things we should be focusing on, rather than, you know, trying to be perfect in how we define our own future and implementing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sharon, I saw you come off mute there. Did you want to weigh in on the potentials for China there?
I definitely agree with that. And just to add, you know, in terms of impact on China domestically from the situation, while electricity is one thing, there's also the issue for agriculture. And I mean, food security is a huge issue for China. It's a very important issue for China. And so given fuel for ag harvest concerns in China, I think there's for opportunities for Canada. I think there's several folds. One is agricultural export that we will see growth in because of the energy crunch in China. And then also Building on Timothy's in terms of the LNG export opportunity, I think, yeah, it's definitely a great opportunity, but how the only way to achieve that is to have infrastructure in place to facilitate that. And so that requires policy and both government and non-government cooperation and business cooperation in Canada in order to achieve these.
Yeah, and I guess in talking about like our ability to export and also going back to what we were talking about earlier in regard to kind of the differentials we're seeing right now between gas markets in North America and gas markets globally, it kind of strikes me as maybe there's two different ways of looking at the opportunities there, where maybe on one end we can export, which is what we've been talking about now, but is there an opportunity to increase to kind of what you were talking about earlier, to made me think of it, should we be looking to attract industry if our energy input prices are much lower than what is being found globally?
But go ahead, bud.
That's exactly what happened in the United States, right? When the United States was able to increase the number of reshoring, I guess, of major industries because of the natural gas boom post 2008. It was a hugely valuable feedstock for the petrochemical industry, for a whole variety of other industries, including just as a low-cost energy source, but also as a direct feed input to manufacturing. That's exactly one avenue, right? Now, is that sort of, has that finished? Is there still room to grow and to reshore? Quite conceivably, there could be, and so that should be part of the conversation. I just want to make a note too about the export business. Back in the day when every cove in the North American continent wanted to host an LNG export plant, the price was $15 a million BTUs. And then we move forward and there's, LNG Canada, and the price was, last year, $5 or $6, maybe it was $15 in the spot market in Shanghai at one point, but then it would disappear. But gauging from what we've seen over this, what we're going to see over this next year, where it's $30 roughly, maybe there will be opportunity to build more of these proposed plants out of North America. I think LNG Canada is maybe in a very sweet position if these prices persist. They're not going to stay. I don't presume they're going to stay at $30, $33 a million BTUs, but if you get to 15 or 17 or 18, it's pretty nice.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the one other thing I definitely wanted to touch on, because I'm sure a lot of people are curious what your take would be on this. Our lack of access to a certain extent to the global market is really what's kept our natural gas prices lower than what we're seeing around the world right now, to a certain extent. What should we expect for Canadians this winter, as we've got forecasts coming out of Europe and Asia of prices only going higher? Should Canadians also be expecting doubling, tripling of their heating bills this winter, or are we isolated from that to a certain extent?
So here's where I issue my CGA caveat that we don't predict gas prices. But you can just look in the media and you can see what's happening in various markets across North America, and the price of natural gas this winter looks very much like it's going to be higher than the price of natural gas last winter. Now, the price of commodity it flows through to the customer, right? So the utilities across North America take a price and they give the same price to the customer, and then but they manage it in certain ways, and this plays to the advantage of the Canadian market. As I said earlier, one, we've got a lot of storage in North America, so that's a great leveler of winter price peaks, right? So it allows you to manage the volume of gases in the marketplace so that you're not exposing customers to great peaks and valleys. Secondly, we've got abundant supply. We don't have the kind of supply constraints. As Sharon noted, we're right next to the United States. The bulk of our exports to the United States, because it's easy to build, or at one time it was easy to build, pipelines to the United States. right? So there's good flow back and forth, and you've got gas coming from Canadian markets going to the U.S. Increasingly, you've got gas from U.S. Eastern markets coming into Canada. So you've got a very robust network with lots of supply points and good storage, which means that the volatility conditions that exist in other markets are just not in North America. That said, there are a variety of local events that can affect price. Weather storms in the Gulf traditionally have an impact on the price of gas. So too can just winter weather, a severe winter, a long winter. So there are a variety of variables, but what you try to do is plan a system that's as robust as possible, that anticipates as many of those variables as possible. And we've done a good job of that in North America. Prices are high. They're still significantly lower than they have been in the past because the fundamentals are very good in the North American market.
Yeah, I agree with Tim. And also the reason why we've seen price increase in Canada, but we haven't seen price increase to the extent compared to European countries, because of the fact that we produce our own natural gas, as Tim said, while Europe depends on Russia, who some may argue is not necessarily a reliable partner, but also the fact that we always almost see higher gas prices in the winter time. In terms of the just as a trade policy economist and coming from the trade perspective, I think that we would see a more commodity price increase as well for this coming winter. Canada imports significantly more from China than it exports to China. 75% of our two-way trade with China is import, and we mainly import intermediate processed goods in addition to iron and steel and so on. So coupled with our recent supply chain clog up or jam during the COVID at ports that we've seen, we will see probably even higher commodity prices given China's recent challenges.
And I guess given some of the, as you mentioned, that industry is really being hit the hardest by the power shutdowns that are happening in China right now, I would assume that that's also going to lead to some supply shortages like what we were seeing previously as well.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Well, we only have 2 minutes left. I think we could carry on this conversation for a few more hours if we had the time, but I don't want to go over by too much here. So, I think in general, we've talked about for Canada, we're not going to be quite as impacted by this as much of the rest of the world, but it is no doubt an important global issue at the moment. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to the panelists especially. A great conversation today. And I need to put in a quick plug too. So these pop-up policy events, we really just they truly are pop-ups, that we have them as important issues jump forward. And we are coincidentally hosting another one next week from the Natural Resource Center on ESG in the Canadian energy landscape. So if you haven't seen it yet, that is exactly 1 week from today. And I would encourage everyone to sign up for that one as well. But otherwise, yeah, thank you everyone. And it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Brendan. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Bud.
Brendan.
Brendan, I see there are a number of questions we didn't get to. I apologize.
I know.
Good stuff on sort of the climate change dimension of all of this, but perhaps another time.
Yes, we might have to have a follow-up. There's a lot of good stuff in the Q&A, and I do apologize that we didn't get a chance to get to it, but yeah, next time for sure.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.